Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this LGIU and Ipsos event, State of the Locals. I'm Jonathan Carr-West. I'm Chief Executive of LGIU, Local Government Information Unit. Many of you on the call are LGIU members, but this is an open event. So I'll just say a tiny bit about who we are, for those of you who may not be familiar with us. We are the UK's biggest independent local government membership body. We were created by three councils just over 40 years ago, but we now have more than 300 member councils and other organisations across the UK, Ireland and Australia. Our job is to support local government, councillors and officers in the work that they do, what we think is vital work that they do for their communities, for their places, and we do that through guidance on legislation and key developments, insight, analysis, research, training, and opportunities like this to come together with colleagues and dig into some of the challenges that we're facing, that councils everywhere are grappling with. And one of our, we're a charity, one of our primary charitable objectives is around strengthening local democracy. And today's event really gets to the heart of that. Because every year at election time, LGIU commissions Ipsos to carry out some polling into public attitudes to local government, to elected members, to service delivery. How important do they think local government is? What do they understand about it? And this year we also included some questions about the role of elected mayors and about the government's reorganisation agenda, which, as you will all know, is in intent incredibly far-reaching, possibly the biggest shake-up of local government for half a century. So those polling results are the starting point for today's discussion. And I'm delighted that we're joined by three incredible speakers. Kieran Pedley is Research Director, Public Affairs UK at Ipsos. Dr. Hannah Bunting is a lecturer in quantitative British politics at the University of Exeter. And Peter Stanyan is Chief Executive of the Association of Electoral Administrators. So they all occupy different roles in the ecosystem, from the sort of research right through to sort of the very sharp end, where Peter's members are actually sort of delivering elections. Before we get started, just a couple of items of housekeeping. We're going to be recording today's session, and we'll share that recording afterwards. Please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A functions for any questions you have as we go through the discussion, and we'll come back to those after the presentations to get views from our speakers, and we'll do our best sort of behind the scenes to collate those questions and sort of put them into sort of sensible groupings. Though bear with us, because that sometimes requires some quite sort of fast scrambling as we go along. If you have any technical difficulties during the session, please reach out to the LGIU events team. Don't reach out to me, because I won't be able to help you, but they absolutely will. So do reach out to them. We're going to record the session, but we won't record the Q&A. So hopefully, so please feel free to be sort of frank and upfront in your questions. And yeah, I think that's everything. So I'm going to shut up and pass the mic over to Kieran to hear about this year's results. Kieran, over to you.
Jonathan mentioned, my name is Kieran Pedley. I'm Director of Politics at Ipsos, and very much looking forward to these local elections as the nerd that I am, but I'm sure we're amongst good company. Given this is the first major set of elections really since the general election last July, and so it will be very interesting to see whether some of the trends we picked up in opinion polling since that time are borne out at those elections. But as Jonathan mentioned, we've done some polling for the LGIU, looking at attitudes to local government, but also some of the changes that have been proposed or that are taking place, and also attitudes to directly elected mayors. And so what that means in practice is that we interviewed a representative sample of English adults in late March of this year. Some of these questions you'll see we've been asking on behalf of LGIU for some time, and there's some trend data. Some of them are new this year, and I'm going to spend about 10 to 15 minutes just going through an overview of these findings, which will be available after the call to sort of look at in more detail for those of you that wish to. But I think first of all, it's worth starting, as ever, just thinking about what the public think of local government generally. It's useful context when we try to understand both attitudes to those changes that we've talked about or alluded to, but also how local elections work. Now, the first thing to say is that the public do recognise the roles that councils and councillors play in the quality of life in their local area. So we asked on a long list, which 2 or 3 of the following do you believe have the most impact on people's everyday lives and the quality of life in your area? And you can see that local councils here, top of the tree for both. So there is a very clear recognition from the public that the local councils, local government matters, has a genuine direct impact on people's day-to-day lives. And that's something that we've seen consistently over time. However, generally speaking, the public do not feel that well informed about what local councils and councillors do and how decision making actually works. So when we ask how much, if anything, would you say you know about the work of MPs, local councillors, or how decisions are taken in local government, you can see that approaching 2/3 say they know not very much or nothing at all about the work of their local councillors and how decisions are taken at the local council. Now, it should be said a majority say the same about what MPs do in Westminster. So in some ways, this data is a reminder to us all involved in government and local government that for a majority of the public, this stuff does not necessarily register in detail on a day-to-day basis. But I think you can see very clearly that when it comes to councils and local government, that feeling is even stronger than for Westminster. So what did the public think of councils and councillors in that context? Well, local councils and councillors are more trusted than the UK government, national media, the civil service, but then less trusted than local community groups and businesses. So if we can imagine a league table of to what extent do you trust each of the following to act in the best interests of people in your local area, you can see that around 4 in 10 trust local councils and councillors a great deal or a fair amount, but slightly over half trust them not very much or not at all. So you can see how that sort of compares local community groups and local businesses. 2/3 trust those, whereas the national media and UK government 2/3 do not. So something of a middling position in this so-called league table. But again, in the context that knowledge is maybe short, more not trusting than trusting of local government. And a similarly worded question that sort of gets to a slightly different thing is how much do you trust each of the following to act in the best interest of the people that they represent? Very, very similar numbers. Majority do not trust local councils or councillors very much or at all. But again, that is there is more trust than there is for central government. We wanted to try to unpick that a little bit more. So who are we talking about when we talk about this 54% that do not trust local councils or the 4 in 10 that do? What we find is that women, older cohorts and non-graduates tend to trust local councils the least, whereas on the flip side, those in London are most trusting of local government. It's interesting, I think, when we talk about devolution and a devolution agenda generally, you can see that outside of London, distrust, if you like, in local government is perhaps strongest. And this reflects all the research Ipsos have done, not necessarily strictly on local government, but just on perceptions of funding settlements and how people in different regions of the country feel their area is treated versus others. There is that discontent outside of Westminster and London as to how things are done. So what about decision making? So we ask, whose views do you think are the most important, if any, when it comes to making decisions that affect the local area? And there is a recognition that the views of residents and also local councillors are important when it comes to decision making. So again, I think what we're starting to see is this combination of a recognition that local government is important, has a profound impact on people's everyday lives, that local councillors are important in how the decision making is made locally. But again, there is this kind of general distrust of government and a lack of knowledge about how things work. And part of the challenge, and we've seen this over several years of this research with LGIU, part of the challenge here is that to some extent, people are quite comfortable with not having much knowledge about what happens locally. So we've asked over several years which of these statements comes closest to your view about how the local council makes decisions about your local public services in your area. And you can see on the right-hand side that 1 in 5 say they're not interested in knowing how decisions are taken as long as the council does its job, or is perceived to. 59%, so 6 in 10 say they want more information, or they want more say in how decisions are made locally. So around a third say they'd like to know more about how decisions are made, but don't necessarily want to be actively involved. Or almost 1 in 4 say they would like to have more of a say in how decisions are taken. But actually, it's only that 12% who want to be actively more involved in how decisions are taken, or there's 3% that say they already are. And so this is part of the challenge of any part of the reputational challenge of any institution or any brand, if you like, that's where there isn't a lot of knowledge about how decisions are taken, and that can breed, dare I say, that can possibly breed a degree of ignorance or misunderstanding. Often it's the case that there isn't that great desire to have that information as long as things are working, or as a perception that people have a say. So that's part of the challenge local government consistently faces. Moving on to local services overall. So we ask every year, do the public think the quality of services in the local area has got worse or better in the last 5 years, or has it stayed about the same? And what's obviously important about this data is that this is the first time we've asked this question for LGIU since the general election. The last round of data was obviously before that. And so what we can see is certainly no great sense of things getting better. Only around 13%, just over 1 in 10 think things have got better. But the public evenly split this year between those that think things are getting worse or have stayed about the same. But what's notable is that there has been a fall in the proportion that think things have got worse, but that's led to maybe an increase in neutrality rather than improvement. I think it's worth saying that our data consistently shows a majority of the public, to a 6 in 10, saying that things are heading in the wrong direction in Britain. So staying about the same is not necessarily something to aspire to, but still less sense of negativity than last year, although that sense of negativity increases with older age groups. For those saying that services have improved, it's not very many, as I say. A range of actors are credited, including local providers of services on behalf of the local authority, local community groups, and the council as well. But when we ask who is to blame for where things have got worse, so that 4 in 10, it's a combination, really. The UK government gets the most blame and the strongest depth of blame. For almost half say the UK government has a great deal of responsibility for things getting worse. But again, as I sort of alluded to earlier, there is a recognition of the Royal Council's play in how things are done. So 8 in 10 think the local council, almost 3 in 4 think local councillors have had are sort of partly responsible for things getting worse in their local area. So another thing we ask about, getting onto the devolution question, is it's about the principles of who should have a say, how decisions are made. We've asked a series of statements whether the public in England agree or disagree with those statements. And what you can see is there's a few statements here, but I think the key message, is that generally speaking, people want local residents to have a say. There's a clear consensus that local residents should always have a say. 8 in 10 say this in the decisions that impact their local area, and that's felt strongest amongst older sort of age cohorts. But there is still this sense as well, slightly counterintuitively or running alongside that it does not matter who makes decisions affecting my local area as long as they're the right ones. So there's this blend of wanting the local residents to have a say, but also recognizing that outcomes are important, and majority saying that too many policy decisions affecting my local area are made outside it. And again, that is a principle that is felt most strongly in the north of England. This idea that decisions are made external to local residents. So getting that balance right is difficult, but is also something that the public want. So let's talk a bit about, for the last sort of 5 minutes, about local government reform and attitudes to that, and also directly elected mayors. So the first thing to say is we regularly ask the public what they are paying attention to, how closely are they following different stories. And look, this won't be a surprise, but the public aren't following government plans to devolve further powers to local governments in England particularly closely. 1 in 3 say they're following it very or fairly closely, but the overwhelming majority of that saying fairly. And one can be skeptical about what that means in practice. But compared to other topics like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or at the time of this research, the Spring Statement, and the sort of the was it the Telegram? I can't remember what group it was now. The Signal chat group leak. The Trump administration, these things are being followed much more closely, and this speaks to the wider point we made earlier about local government not being something that people are very familiar with. But when we ask, and we should recognise off the bat, this is a challenging question to ask. But when we ask whether the public prefer or think the two-tier district and county council system or a single unitary authority system works best for local government, there's absolutely no consensus that unitary authorities are the best way to do things. In fact, if you look at the data, public are more likely to say, in England, they're more likely to say that a combination of district and county councils responsible for different services is the best way to do things compared to a single unitary authority responsible for all services in the area. And then, of course, you've got 37% that say either they don't know or that there's no real difference. So striking, I think, here that when we talk about local government reform, there's certainly no consensus that unitary authorities are definitely the best way to do things, and therefore that's a change that should happen. On the delaying of elections, I think the best way, we asked whether that was supported or opposed. I think probably the best way to summarize this data is that there's no real strong public view on this. 23% support those elections being delayed, 30% oppose it, so slightly more oppose than support. But again, you've got almost half either neutral on the question or don't know. Labour voters slightly more supportive than average. Reform voters overwhelmingly, majority oppose. But really, in terms of public opinion as a whole, no great groundswell of anger there, it seems. And a couple of slides in closing on mayors and directly elected mayors. We asked whether having a directly elected mayor is a good or bad thing for a local area, if either. Again, I wouldn't say there's passionate public consensus on this, but certainly more than twice the public in England are more than twice as likely to think that they're a good thing rather than a bad thing. So 39% think directly elected mayors are a good thing, 17% say bad. Older age groups and reform UK voters, and obviously there's a bit of a correlation there to some extent, the most likely to say bad thing. It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see if reform UK voters still think that after the upcoming local elections. But certainly more good than bad, but no overwhelming majority consensus here either. And then the final question that we asked was to try and unpick that a little bit more. We asked whether having a directly elected mayor had a positive or negative impact, if either, on a range of areas for a local area. And again, there's a large degree of neutrality here, which I think again reflects the fact that knowledge of local government is fairly weak. But I think some of them, the more positives were about giving an area a voice in Westminster or central government. I suspect, we don't drill down that locally, but I suspect that feeling is probably most acutely felt in areas with a very high profile local mayor. There's a feeling that certainly more than positive and negative that directly elected mayors can make local government more accountable to local residents and potentially bring local communities together. So there's a range of sort of benefits that the public tend to see more positively than negatively directly elected mayors, but value for money for the taxpayer is one that the public are more split on. You can see this at the bottom. 28% think directly elected mayors have a positive impact on that. 27% say that they have a negative. And again, as I've sort of alluded to earlier, Labour voters, generally speaking, more positive about directly elected mayors. Generally, older age groups, more negative. And those who claim to know a bit more, be familiar with how decisions are made locally, were more positive about mayors than the general public. So again, that's probably reassuring that those people that are more engaged with local government are more positive rather than negative. So a whistle-stop tour for the data there. Before I hand over, just a couple of remarks in closing. Just to leave you with, I mean, the public do recognise, again, to reiterate, that local councils and councillors have a significant role to play in everyday life in Britain, and local government is more trusted than central government. So these are some positives, I think, around for those advocating for local government. However, knowledge of local government tends to be quite limited, and even though there's more trust in local government than central, there is still a lot of cynicism and negativity around local government too. We shouldn't sort of pretend otherwise. And on the reforms themselves, probably speaking to some of that lack of knowledge, there's no real public consensus about whether unitary or the sort of twin systems of local government are better, a better model. But then opposition to elections being postponed is limited to 3 in 10. So it's still there. It's still a significant number of people, but this doesn't feel like an issue that's really going to animate the public as a whole. And on directly elected mayors, as I've just alluded to, they're seen as more of a good thing than a bad thing for local government. And the more knowledgeable people are, the more positive that they tend to be. So with that, I will hand back over to Jonathan and the team.
Thank you, Kieran. That's excellent. And as always, really, really fascinating insights from that polling. I have loads of questions, but I'm going to restrain myself. And I'm going to hand over to Hannah. As I said, Hannah is a lecturer in quantitative British politics at the University of Exeter, which means she's hugely expert in everything to do with British elections, parties, party systems, political trust, measurement, and all of the stuff that speaks to what we're talking about today. So, Hannah, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan. Can everybody see those slides?
Yes.
Yep, wonderful. Okay, yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. I'd like to sort of give a couple of reflections and some analysis today on 3 interconnected themes that I'm really thinking about at this election. And these are the changing dynamics of party competition. As you said there, Jonathan, in particular, the increase in the number of parties and the number of candidates that are appearing on the ballot papers, and how this impacts already quite troubling levels of participation, and also the gender imbalance or balance of candidates. So here I've created a bar graph of each of the 23 councils that we have in England that are up for election in this cycle. Each of the bars is a party or a party group and coloured by that party, and the bar is the percentage of seats that those parties are covering in that local authority, and then the label is the number of seats that they're covering. Hopefully you can see it okay. It's quite big on my screen, but it might depend on your setup. So we have 1,400 wards that are up for election this time, and that's just over 1,600 vacancies. And there's sort of around between 55 and 98, I think, is the lower and upper of number of seats available per local authority. Some of those will have had boundary changes, such as Buckinghamshire that we've got first up there. And there's over 8,000 candidates. So there's 8,138 up for these vacancies. So that's roughly 5 per vacancy, right? But some ballot papers will be much longer than others, depending on which area you're in. Now, this is the first time that Reform are contesting most of the seats. In fact, they've got the most candidates up and the largest candidate coverage. So they are contesting 99% of seats. I think there's only 10 seats that they're not contesting in 3 different local authorities. Now, that's not counting those who have since been suspended from the party. That's who will appear on the ballot paper as Reform. And next we have the Conservatives, who are contesting 97%, and Labour 94%. Now, this isn't unusual for this point in the election cycle for Labour not to contest every seat, because it's not really their heartlands, right? They don't tend to do well at this point in the electoral cycle anyway, and you might have spotted that in Wiltshire, they're actually contesting fewer than half of the seats there, the Labour Party. Then we have the Liberal Democrats on 85%, and we've got Greens contesting 72% of seats. there are 60 different parties on ballot papers across all of these 23 local authorities, and nearly half of those are local parties. Now, they're only contesting 128 seats overall, but they do have a significant impact on these local elections, particularly for that local area, and you know, maybe it's just one seat in some areas. That's sort of why I've created their own party group there that you can see in black on these lines. And I'm thinking about this because my research published last year actually shows that too much choice on a ballot paper and for the electorate can lead to lower turnout. Now, that might seem counterintuitive at first, but if people are not really connected to a party or to a candidate, and they're presented with all of these different options, not only can this impact the results of how many options that there are to choose from, right? Just mathematically speaking, a couple of votes can really matter when you've got a longer ballot paper, but also it means that I don't know who to vote for, right? I don't know who is best going to represent my local needs or my personal needs, whatever it might be. And so I'm actually less likely to turn out. And yeah, that the uncertainty mathematically feeds into that decision of whether they will turn out or not as well. Now, often the story in national media, at least, can be sort of, you know, who is this hurting the most of these elections? Is it Labour or Conservative? And at this point, this year in particular, even then, you know, is Reform going to become the second party? But we all know that actually these elections are really about local representation and local democracy. And that's why some of these local parties can do really well, because they can focus on those local issues and really galvanize that local support. So thinking about Reform as this sort of new addition and this big swathe of candidates on the ballot papers, I'm interested to see whether they can position themselves as a strong local candidate, so sort of galvanize on that local support, and perhaps increase turnout because of that, right? Because people have got an option that they can connect to and that they recognize as a national party as well. Or do they decrease turnout by adding to the ballot paper? So that's sort of, yeah, another theme that I'm thinking about. And here I've got a different type of graph, and this looks at turnout over the past 2 years of elections for various reasons, but mainly because this is when Reform really started to field candidates, and whether there was a Reform candidate present on the ballot paper or whether there wasn't, right? And you can see here that seats with a Reform candidate had 1 to 2 percentage points lower turnout than areas where there wasn't a Reform candidate. Now, 1 to 2 might not seem like very much, but when we remember that over these 2 years, less than a third of people voted overall, sort of when we look at the average, and in some areas it's in the teens turnout. So if you think 1 to 2%, then it's actually become sort of quite significant. But you can also see the sort of cluster of dots there. The Reform only really contested, I think it was around 10% of seats in these 2 election years, so it's not super easy to draw a definitive conclusion. However, I've also looked at whether there were independents, others, local parties, so anything that's not really a main party on the ballot paper, or whether there wasn't. And the difference here is independents and others, local parties, they tend to contest around 50% of seats, so it's much easier to compare. Turnout in 2023 was 2 points lower when there was an independent or other on the ballot paper, and that was less in 2024 at just 0.6% lower, but it still was a decreased turnout at this longer ballot paper. For those of you who are sort of statistically minded, I've tested it and it is significant. Now, it may be that these parties emerge in places that are more disaffected, right? So they're naturally lower areas of turnout. But when you sort of link it to that existing research, that choice is worse for participation, then it also might not be the case. But also those two things could be happening at the same time. A final theme that I want to consider is gender. So do these parties widen or perhaps close the gender gaps in candidates when they are added to these ballot papers? So my next sort of few slides are about that. Now, you may have seen the research by the 50/50 project, who showed that there were more Davids than Sarahs as local candidates for this year's local elections. And I've just sort of created a word cloud there where you can see the frequency of all of these different names. And it's very clear that men's names are more prominent than women's. And so what I've done here is I've taken the list of candidates for all 23 local authorities, so all of those 8,000 candidates, and estimated their gender based on first name. So it's not perfect, but we've got an estimation of their gender here. And you can see in the bar graph that on this binary gender split, there's much fewer women in every local authority. Now, last year at the State of the Locals, I presented that actually the Shire counties have the greatest gender imbalance anyway. So this point of the electoral cycle tends to see the lowest frequency of women, both who stand and who win. And that's also driven by the Conservative dominance in these areas. So this year is completely in keeping with that trend, right? It's at pretty much dead on a third of candidates this year are women. That's compared to 35% last year and 34% the year before. So although that seems like a drop, it's actually comparable to this point in the local elections cycle. Every authority has less than 40% women standing, and in 2, which is Lincolnshire and Staffordshire, there are less than 30% of women who are on the ballot papers. So now I'm sort of thinking about, but does the addition of these extra parties, right, to link all of these themes together, impact this gender balance? So here we've got the gender breakdown of candidates by party, okay, and this is pulling all of these 23 authorities together. And you can quite clearly see that Reform are even lower than the Conservatives, right? And these are the 2 parties that are contesting the most seats. So this is likely to be what is driving this gender imbalance. They are at less than a quarter, and Conservatives are not even hitting 30%. But you can see that there is that gender balance across all of the parties. So even Labour and the Greens, who tend to do really well in this area and getting really close to 50/50, there's still quite a considerable gap. Now, this does vary by local authority. I've got sort of 3 examples here. Labour are nearly 50/50 in Doncaster, and the Greens are hitting that exactly in Doncaster at 50/50. But in that area, Reform, there are fewer than 15% of women who are standing, and in Leicester, I think it's at 11%. It's actually 9 councils where Reform have got fewer than 20% women who are standing as their candidates. Perhaps a more positive note is that if we look at mayors, which I haven't really looked at in this presentation, there's at least 1 woman candidate on every ballot paper for mayor. But this isn't a great election for gender equality. So some final reflections, because I'm sure I'm at my time. These elections are, of course, the opportunity for new representation, and it's leading us into this period of planned reorganisation, as we've already spoken about today. And of course, all of the day-to-day really important work that local councillors do. Now, the addition of Reform is going to be, and already is, a big national story, right, which will impact the national picture, and it will be of media focus. But actually, this increasing number of candidates, and we see them fielding candidates in basically every seat, like I said, over 99%, means that we might actually see lower levels of participation, lower turnout, and an even greater gender imbalance in our local authorities. And if they get elected, not just candidates, they will be councillors, and across these local elections. Thank you.
Brilliant. Hannah, thank you so much. That's really fascinating. And I think, yeah, really gets us behind the kind of some of the obvious stories and into some of the other things that are really happening now. And that link between sort of number of candidates, or the sort of reverse correlation between the number of candidates and turnout is so fascinating, because it's quite counterintuitive. So that's really interesting data. Okay, so look, at LGIU, we always say that elections are not the be all and end all of democracy, but they are a really an essential foundation of it. And we like to make the point, often forgotten, that they only happen because thousands of electoral services officers in councils up and down the country are working incredibly hard to make sure they happen, and to make sure they don't just happen, but that they're fair and that they're sort of open, and all the things that we, frankly, I think as voting members of the public rather take for granted. But it's a huge amount behind that. So I'm delighted that we have here Peter Stanyan, who's Chief Executive of the AEA, the Association of Electoral Administrators, who are exactly those people. So Peter, over to you. Tell us a bit about where your members are as we move towards these elections.
Thanks, Jonathan. I feel slightly, the fascinating figures there from Hannah, from Kieran before. And I think just putting it in the context of over 8,000, close to 9,000 candidates being involved in the election, puts it into context about the complexity of the elections taking place in the areas where they are. Take that back one stage to link in something that Kieran said with regards to local government reorganisation. I think there was a collective sigh of relief when finally decisions were made where elections were taking place and where they were being postponed. Taking politics out of it, it meant that actually planning could continue in the areas where it already commenced. It's often, I think there's a misconception that elections take 6 weeks to organise. They don't. They were already in train way back in December as the plans were taking place. So a lot of things need to be unpicked or to be regurgitated, shall we say, going forwards once that decision was made. So now we're fully into it. We're literally a week and a half away now from well, in fact, the election's underway with postal votes already out there. All the deadlines for registration and the like have now gone. It's now down as we approach the actual delivery of the process itself. So what have we got in our hands? I think the sort of things Hannah listing the actual elections taking place. I'll add two to that. In terms of the Isle of Scilly elections are taking place as well. In fact, I understand there's 4 uncontested seats, the only ones in the country on the principal area elections taking place. We can't forget the Runcorn and Helsby by-election for Parliament taking place as well, which is obviously going to be an interesting litmus test as it goes forwards. I'd also, again, Hannah made brief reference to the mayoral elections taking place, 2 of which are brand new. So it's going to be an interesting take in those 2 areas in terms of what that actually means, and we'll add to the sort of the figures that Kieran was talking about what is it the local government does, what influence does it have in terms of delivery in those sort of areas. So the sorts of things that I think there's almost no story in some respects with the delivery. It's not to say all that work is not going on. This time last year, as we approached the local elections, and then the former Prime Minister dragged his lectern out onto Downing Street in the rain to fire the starting gun again. We had scheduled, and then we actually saw the storm with the unscheduled parliamentary election taking place. It was literally from a standing start, as I think we all knew in that respect. So in terms of these ones coming forward, we knew these were taking place. We knew, apart from the disruption that the LGR decision needed to come to, it has meant that the planning has been able to be done in a far more sensible, structured way. We issued our report in terms of the blueprint for changes to the electoral processes, and one of the things we talked about was timetables. We've still got the same timetable, but that's the pressures within that are so much easier to deal with when we know the election is taking place, postal voting, poll card production, ballot paper production, and the like. So things are moving forward very well in that respect. Lots of things we talked about at the July elections last year was the pressure on supply chain. That's not there in the same levels this time round. Not every single local authority across the whole of the UK is up for election, so there is capacity within the system. That means the pressures that were there last year, fairly or unfairly on partners such as Royal Mail, fairly or unfairly on partners such as printers, is not there in the same pressure as it was as we ran into the parliamentary election in particular. But that's not to say that the lessons learned from those particular elections have not meant a lot more closer scrutiny in terms of making sure that the individuals are able to deliver in those sorts of areas. Couple of areas I'll touch on, give some time back, I think, for Q&A. One of the big challenges in the past has been around staffing, for example. how can we make sure we have got the polling station staffed? The counts is less of an issue, but strangely enough, as a result of the local government reorganisation, there is greater capacity in certain areas to assist neighbouring authorities in terms of actually staffing polling stations and the like going forwards. That won't be there year on year, so the issue hasn't gone away, but for the 1st of May, certainly we're not getting any feedback from the sector that the pressures are on there in terms of either venues or the bodies to fill those venues going forwards. Laura will have mentioned this time last year in the similar session that was held, the challenges of the Elections Act 2022 coming into being. They're there now. They are becoming business as usual. We've talked over the years around voter ID, the positives and negatives, etc. Administratively, it's in place. It's working well in terms of what the processes actually are. How that plays out in terms of participation is not there for administrators. They are there. You're on the list. You've got the ID. You're coming through, and those systems are working very well. The other elements of it are also now rolling out quite smoothly, and the teams are involved. So that confidence is in the system now to ensure that the delivery can still be done in those ways. I think the key, it links back to Hannah's statistics with regards to the candidates. There's been a fundamental shift because of the involvement of new parties, of independents, but mainly the reform being a big influence in terms of candidates coming into the election, about the knowledge within the system, the need to make sure that every single candidate going through the system has access to the same resources, the same knowledge base, so that administrators, returning officers are able to assist in terms of process. That's a challenge, because that will vary from area to area as we go through. And one of the big areas of that challenge is around security. I was honoured to give evidence to the Speakers' Conference in terms of the intimidation of candidates and elected officials, and be able to feed back from an administrative perspective around elections. But things have moved on again since the locals and the general election from last year, in that the police have certainly begun to work very much more closely with returning officers in making sure that candidates have access to the correct security advice they need to have. Operation Ford is now in existence, and if anybody who's on the call who is a candidate has not received information as regards to what assistance is available to them, please contact your local returning officer. Look at the government.uk, gov.uk website. There is the actual advice in terms of the personal security things there. That's a big change in terms of comms between returning officers, who have no powers of investigation in an election, can do very little other than act as the gatekeeper to move things on to the investigating authorities. But they're able now to communicate with the police to make sure the correct advice is available there. So I think I'll leave it with, this is a different type of election. It will not necessarily be the same in 4 years' time, but every time we come around the county council election timetable, it's a different nature of election, because county returning officers do not run the elections. They rely very much on the districts, the boroughs in their areas to deliver that. And the same with the regional mayoral elements, where they are far more regionalised approaches. That to me has a massive positive effect in the intervening years, because actually it's the one time where districts and counties can make sure they're talking to each other in terms of sharing that information, in terms of delivering good democracy across the county areas. The districts know what they're doing. The county have a lot of levers they can pull to assist that one. And one of the big areas that will, I think, play out as we go through in the next few years or so is around accessibility to the process. The records counties hold, whatever the shape of local government will be when we come around the next 2-3 years or whatever, will ensure that individual electors can receive access to the system far more simply than they have been able to do in the past. So an area of positivity, I think, in terms of this cycle of elections, with all the challenges it brings. But Jonathan, there's no major incidences that are occurring as of this weekend. I don't know what's happened today, but I think the key point to all of this is that actually the work is there behind the scenes going on. The good news being scheduled means it can be planned out, and a lot of the lessons we learned from last year are now being rolled out across those areas where elections are taking place.
Brilliant. Well, Peter, that's cheering news. I mean, it's good to hear. I mean, certainly I remember when this time last year, a lot more. I mean, I know it was a bumper election year last year, and then we had the sort of, we knew there was going to be a general election. We didn't know when it was going to be, but a real sense this time last year that the system was kind of not creaking, but was holding together, but was under significant strain. So it's good to hear that it doesn't feel like that this time next year. Right, I've got loads of questions, but we've also got some coming through on the chat, so I'll defer to those and direct them a little bit, and then but speakers do feel free to jump in. Question from Jonathan Flowers. He lives in an area with an exceptionally active town council, and says, I suspect anyone in my area or other areas with such active town councils would answer questions about quote unquote local council differently and more positively. Do we have any research on different attitudes across the tiers? And I'm going to wind that out a bit. Kieran, to you first, but I guess just sort of more generally, what do we know? One of the things that we anticipate with local government reorganisation is a lot of councils starting to look at town councils, bigger parish councils, and them playing a bit of a role. Do we know anything about, either from this research or other stuff you've done, about how people feel about those local, very local councils?
Yeah, I must be honest, it's not an area we've explored in this polling or that commonly, looking at the town councils versus county and districts and so on. I think what I would say is I'd just reiterate what I said earlier, that knowledge of local government is fairly scarce or fairly minimal. And so I think we know that local government and local politics is hyper local in terms of what people think about their particular council, but I don't think we have any data that sort of suggests that, generally speaking, town councils are more popular than county and so on. I think what was striking from our research today was the lack of any consensus, or certainly the fact that it was a minority view that unitary authorities are the way to go. Actually, there was the data I presented earlier showed that there was quite a lot of openness to the two-tier system, which is being phased out. So I think from that you could surmise that I suspect the idea of a town council, which is even more local, would probably be popular, but I'm not familiar with research that backs it up.
Hannah, do we know anything about sort of candidates in town councils? And I mean lower tier councils, I mean parish councils more generally, but you have some very active town councils that are quite substantial, quite significant budgets. Has there been any research on the sort of candidate characteristics of those, either in terms of gender or party?
Very little, unfortunately, mainly due to data availability. There is some evidence that actually people are more likely to be asked to stand at that very local level, and that this therefore might be women, because women are the most likely to have been asked. And so there is a bit of a gender interaction there. And I think it's a really interesting question, because we know that the public want their local representation to be local, but that word local means something different depending on where you live and depending on sort of who you are and how involved you are with your community. For some people, that might be the town. For others, it might be a city. And how we sort of navigate that through this reorganization is a really interesting question, because, yeah, as you mentioned, there might be sort of a resurgence in town and parish councils to sort of ensure that we keep that local connection even while more power is being given to local authorities.
That's interesting. Let's go to the other end of the geographical scale and talk about mayors a bit. Kieran, as you pointed out, this research suggests a pretty positive view of mayors. Benjamin Hobbs on the Q&A is asking whether we have any breakdown of that attitude in places that already have them versus places that are due to get them.
We don't, but I think that what's interesting when you look at the local mayoral elections in the previous years is that there clearly is a lot of engagement with that model of government in the areas that have them. I mean, we saw some of the incumbent mayors, even the Conservative mayors, ended up losing their contest, doing much better than the party nationally. So I think there is definitely you can surmise, I think, from the results themselves in previous mayoral elections, that there is a lot of engagement from the local community, even if turnout isn't necessarily sky high still. there is engagement with the individual, so to speak. But the actual polling we've done today that doesn't break it out in that way. That's something maybe we could explore separately.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Hannah, what about, you mentioned that all of the mayoral elections coming up next in just over a week have at least one woman on the ballot list, on the candidate list. What do we know about? I guess there are several sort of fairly high-profile women who are mayors, but how have women? Does that because the mayor is very focused on a sort of a person? It's a very individual. How does that play out in terms of gender? Does that help women or hinder women in terms of sort of the voting?
Yeah, it can really depend. For a woman candidate that is very motivated, and often women candidates have to be more highly qualified than their male counterparts to sort of get to the same level of representation or level of government. But it can actually work quite well if that woman has a local connection. Women are often spoken about in terms of their motherhood, and if they've got children in local schools, that kind of thing, that can really help the candidate when it is such a local and personal election rather than sort of a party-based election. But on the other hand, I think it can make it less attractive to women candidates who are thinking about going forward for those positions because there's such that personal scrutiny. So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, I guess. It can be really beneficial, but it might also be a little bit off-putting.
And what about turnout because I guess going right back to sort of the first wave of mayors sort of introduced by George Osborne back in sort of 14, 15, there was this sort of idea that because mayors were sort of high profile and, it was simple to understand that this, one of the ways in which they would enhance democracy is that they would drive perhaps greater turnout than we generally see in local elections. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that hasn't really been the case, or has it?
No, it's not really played out in the way that it was intended, but there has also been playing around with the electoral system and how you might elect these mayors and how those votes would actually be counted. And, most people only really pay attention when there's a general election happening, and that's why you see turnout higher at general elections, even though, it wasn't particularly high this time around. And to have a different electoral system for a mayor than for what people are used to for their local MP, I think that has had a damaging impact on what could have been a turnout boost. Now, of course, that's all changed. So we might see, especially with the introduction of these new mayors, that will just have that first past the post system. We might start to see that happen now. So it could have been more of an administrative or legislative choice that actually, didn't have the same impact that it intended to.
Yeah. Okay, Peter, just think about the mayoral elections. Does that, obviously the intention is that we will have mayors across the whole country the government would like that to be by the end of this parliament, but certainly that's its intention. How does that fit in with the kind of the cycle of and the sort of workload of electoral administrators? Is it sort of fine because they go alongside other elections, or does it add significant strain onto the system?
I think it reflects just the system that's in place at the time. So they won't just come by themselves because there's the other reorganisation taking place. So it'll be interesting to see if there's an upsurge in terms of parish and town council interest, because we haven't got coverage of parish and town council across the whole of the country yet. There'll be a number of CGRs, community government reviews, that will be needed as a result of the reorganisation. But in terms of the actual structure itself, again, I go back to those words I used earlier. Scheduled polls are reasonably straightforward to organise. So the fact you have a mayoral, a regional mayoral, it just needs good communication across a particular area to make sure that when that is rolled out alongside other polls, everyone knows what's taking place. A lot of it comes down to the communication side of things. What do each of the individual areas, the individual roles themselves do? I have personal experience of that in London, where we had the 3 effective elections taking place with the mayor and the 2 separate polls for the assembly. And it'll be interesting if that's ever been cracked in terms of what is it that each of those separate layers does within the same environment. So I think it's more comms than it is actually the administrative burdens put onto the system.
Yeah, that's interesting, and that also reflects one of the things we've heard from people is a degree of pressure. You talked, what I'd call sort of electoral dark matter in these elections, of the places that aren't having elections. We've heard quite a lot of people in places that are sort of finding residents saying, but there are no elections this year. Well, yes, there are. Ours haven't been cancelled, and the degree of confusion around that is that reflecting in what your members are picking up?
Not necessarily. I don't think again, it comes back to, again, I think a point Hannah made with regards to turnout at parliamentary elections is generally higher than it is at local elections. So there wasn't the upsurge. There was I'm guessing, and Kieran would be able to advise better, a spike in terms of the interest in the cancellation or the postponement of the elections. But generally speaking, it's when it comes through the poll card hits the mat and the local candidates get involved that you start to see the elections taking place.
Okay, thank you. And look, questions about reform. Hannah, you flagged this up. I mean, that your graph is very striking. From putting up more seat candidates than anywhere else. This is slightly unfair because it's not part of this research. But I was just wondering, how does that compare to? I mean, that's obviously a much larger set of candidates than we saw from UKIP or the Brexit Party. But how much larger do we think that is?
Yeah, if I had to put an estimation on the magnitude, yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but it's definitely much more widespread.
Yeah.
Which I think is a sort of a testament to their party machine, because they got into government and they've got MPs. They're becoming a much more established political party, so they're able to sort of field these candidates in these huge, across all of these areas.
And obviously that's been one of the big questions, is their sort of organizational capacity, and your graph provides an answer to that, I guess. Kieran, another question on the Q&A. Do we anticipate, do we anticipate particularly conservative groups locally doing deals with reform to achieve control of councils in areas where there may not be outright winners? Do we have any insight?
Well, I think, you kind of have to ask Reform and the Conservative Party about that. That is going to be an interesting, very, very important and interesting dynamic, because if we take a step back to the broader political situation in the UK, there is obviously intense discussion about this idea of the Conservatives and Reform merging in the future, or one taking over the other. And in the past, there's been speculation about Nigel Farage leading the Conservative Party and all this sorts of stuff. And we can all debate like the relative likelihood of some of those things happening. But of course, Nigel Farage has kind of gone big on the idea that the Tory brand is broken and Reform is going to replace it. So then to do that and then work with the Conservatives locally would be, I think, challenging messaging. But then, of course, the reality of local government is the reality of local government. So that's going to be a major flashpoint, major talking point for them, I think.
I was asked about this by a journalist last week, and I went out on a limb and predicted there would be less of it than people were speculating about. So watch this space to prove how useless a pundit I am. But I think it's not going to happen at any great scale. Final question, because we're out of time. Really interesting question from Jess Norman about, look, what can we do? That lack of awareness about how decisions are made in councils, and what councils do. See that people think they're important, but people don't really understand. What can we do about that? Very quick final thought from each of you. How do we help people understand better how councils work and how important? I'll start with Peter, throwing you the tough one first.
I think, in my mind, it's getting away from the centrist way that Parliament does everything. I think getting into the mainstream media just to say, and you do realise that these elections are taking place and these are the services that are dealt with by your local authority. So I think it's very much mainstream media to highlight local government.
100% agree. Hannah?
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. Using the community leaders who might not be actually part of local government also to spread the word and show how much they are working with the local authority, I think could be really effective.
Kieran?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that we have to be realistic about what can be achieved there, because ultimately you can lead a horse to water, so to speak, but you can't make it drink. But I think that it's going to be a very local effort for individual authorities, and I suspect that different areas of the country will be more successful at it than others.
Thank you all. We are, as ever, defeated by time, and I've gone 2 minutes over, which is poor chairing on my part, so apologies. But I would just like to close by thanking everyone, thanking our three speakers, Peter, Hannah, and Kieran. Really fascinating insights, really thought-provoking, and we could continue for hours. But most of all, thank you to all of you for joining us here this morning. Just to say that we will be circulating a link to the full research paper around the polling and to a recording of this conversation. We hope to continue the conversation with all of you. And to those of you who are directly involved in local elections on 1st May, either as officers or as candidates, thank you so much, and best of luck, and I hope it goes well. Thank you.